The morning mist hung thick over the Cahto reservation like a grey blanket. Sarah Martinez adjusted her camera strap and checked her notebook. One more time. As a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles, she had spent months convincing the tribal council to let her document their traditional hunting practices. Today was the day she would finally witness something her ancestors had done for generations. "You sure about this, city girl?" asked Tom Whitehorse, the tribal elder who had agreed to be her guide. His weathered face showed years of experience in these mountains, and his dark eyes held both wisdom and concern. "The old ways aren't just for show, they're real and they can be dangerous." Sarah nodded firmly. "I need to capture the authentic experience. My grandmother was Cahto, but she never taught me our ways before she passed. This documentary isn't just work for me, it's personal." Tom studied her for a long moment, then shouldered his rifle. "All right. But you do exactly what I say, when I say it." These mountains don't forgive mistakes. They hiked deeper into the forest, following ancient trails that Sarah's equipment-heavy boots struggled with. The documentary crew she had originally planned to bring was replaced by just her and a single camera operator, Marcus, who had experience filming in wilderness conditions. The tribal council had been clear: too many outsiders would disturb the spiritual balance of the hunt. "Tell me about the traditions," Sarah said, slightly out of breath as they climbed a steep ridge. Her camera captured the morning light filtering through the towering redwoods. "Cahto hunters have walked these paths for over 1,000 years, Tom explained, moving with surprising grace for a man in his 60s. "We don't just hunt for meat, we hunt for balance. Take only what the forest gives, and always give thanks for what you receive." Marcus, walking behind them with his camera equipment, struggled more than Sarah. His usual work involved controlled studio environments, not mountain hiking. "How much further?" he panted. "Distance isn't measured in steps out here," Tom replied. "It's measured in respect. The deer will let us know when we're ready." As they walked, Tom shared stories of his grandfather, who had been one of the last Cahto hunters to learn the old ways before the government tried to eliminate their culture. "They wanted us to forget who we were," he said, his voice carrying old pain. "But some knowledge is too important to lose." Sarah felt a deep connection to these words. Growing up in the city, she had always felt something missing, a piece of herself she couldn't identify. When her grandmother died and left her a box of old photographs and tribal artifacts, Sarah knew she had to find her way back to her roots. The forest around them was alive with sounds: birds calling, branches creaking in the wind, and the distant sound of running water. Tom moved like he was part of this world, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth that were invisible to Sarah and Marcus. "See here," Tom said, kneeling beside a large pine tree. He pointed to scratches in the bark. "Buck rubbed his antlers here, maybe 2 days ago. Big one, from the height of these marks." Sarah knelt beside him, filming as he explained the signs. This was exactly the kind of authentic knowledge she wanted to preserve. Too many traditional skills were disappearing as older generations passed away without teaching the young. They continued deeper into the mountains, the civilized world falling away behind them. Cell phone service had disappeared hours ago, and Sarah felt both excited and slightly nervous about being so isolated. The documentary meant everything to her career, but more than that, it represented her chance to understand her heritage. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about these mountains," Sarah shared as they paused for water. "She said they held the spirits of all our ancestors." Tom smiled. She wasn't wrong. Every tree, every stone has memory. That's why we ask permission before we hunt, and why we never take more than we need. The spiritual aspect of hunting was foreign to Sarah's urban mind, but she found herself drawn to the idea. In Los Angeles, everything felt disconnected and temporary. Here, she sensed something permanent and meaningful. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead. "How do you know where to find the deer?" "They'll find us," Tom said simply, "when the time is right." As if summoned by his words, they heard a sound in the distance, the crack of a branch under heavy feet. Tom immediately raised his hand for silence, his entire demeanor changing from teacher to hunter. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was it, the moment she had come to capture. She signaled Marcus to start recording, and they both moved as quietly as possible behind Tom. The experienced hunter moved like a shadow through the trees, reading the forest with senses sharpened by decades of practice. Sarah tried to follow his example, but her boots seemed impossibly loud on the forest floor. Through a gap in the trees ahead, she caught her first glimpse of their quarry. A magnificent buck stood in a small clearing, his antlers catching the filtered sunlight. He was larger than any deer Sarah had ever seen, and for a moment she forgot about the documentary and simply stared in wonder. Tom slowly raised his rifle, his movements controlled and deliberate. Sarah positioned herself to capture the shot while staying out of his way. This was the culmination of everything she had come to document. The intersection of tradition, skill, and respect for nature that defined Cahto hunting culture. The buck seemed to sense their presence but wasn't alarmed. He continued grazing, occasionally lifting his head to scan the forest. Tom waited patiently, his rifle steady. "Not there!" Sarah whispered urgently, realizing Tom was aiming for a shot that would wound rather than kill cleanly. Her grandmother's stories had emphasized the importance of a clean, respectful kill, but her words came too late. Tom's finger was already on the trigger, and her voice startled him just as he fired. The shot rang out through the forest, echoing off the mountainsides like thunder. The buck leaped high into the air, then stumbled. Blood appeared on his flank, not the clean chest shot that would have ended things quickly, but a painful wound that would cause suffering. "No!" Sarah cried out, horrified by what she had caused. The wounded animal bolted into the thick forest, crashing through underbrush in panic and pain. Tom immediately shouldered his rifle and began following the blood trail. "We have to track him," Tom said grimly. "A wounded deer will suffer for hours if we don't finish what we started. This is exactly what I hoped wouldn't happen." Sarah felt sick to her stomach. Her documentary about preserving traditional hunting practices had instead resulted in exactly what those practices were designed to prevent: unnecessary animal suffering. Marcus continued filming, capturing the grim reality of their situation. "Should I stop recording?" he asked quietly. "No," Sarah said, her voice heavy with regret. "People need to see what happens when tradition is disrupted. This is my fault and I need to document the consequences." Tom was already several yards ahead, following drops of blood on leaves and disturbed earth. "He's heading toward the ravine," he called back, "moving fast despite the wound." Sarah and Marcus struggled to keep up as Tom moved quickly through the forest. The blood trail was easy to follow at first, but as they climbed higher into more difficult terrain, the signs became harder to read. "There," Tom pointed to a steep slope ahead. "He went down there." The ravine was treacherous, full of loose rocks and hidden drops. Sarah realized they were entering truly dangerous territory, far from any possible help. The documentary that was supposed to showcase the wisdom of traditional hunting had become a desperate rescue mission. As they carefully made their way down the slope, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching them, judging their actions. Every shadow seemed to hide accusation. Every sound felt like criticism of her interference with forces she didn't understand. The hunt was far from over, and Sarah was beginning to understand that some lessons could only be learned through painful experience. The blood trail led deeper into the wilderness, and they had no choice but to follow wherever it might lead. The blood trail led them deeper into the ravine than Sarah had imagined possible. Each drop of crimson on the forest floor felt like a mark of her failure, a reminder that her well-intentioned interference had created this suffering. Tom moved ahead with grim determination, his experienced eyes following signs that Sarah could barely see. "He's slowing down," Tom observed, kneeling beside a larger pool of blood on a flat rock. "But he's also getting more desperate. Wounded animals become unpredictable." Marcus adjusted his camera equipment, the weight clearly affecting his ability to navigate the difficult terrain. "How long can a deer survive with that kind of wound?" "Hours, maybe days," Tom replied, his voice heavy with regret. "That's why we never leave a wounded animal. It goes against everything our people believe." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. "I should have stayed quiet. I should have trusted your judgment." "What's done is done," Tom said, but his tone wasn't unkind. "Now we deal with the consequences. That's what being Cahto means. Taking responsibility for our actions and their effects on the world around us." They continued following the trail as the afternoon sun began to fade. The wounded buck had chosen a path through some of the most difficult terrain in the mountains, leading them across loose shale slopes and through dense thickets that tore at their clothes. Sarah's designer hiking boots, which had seemed so practical in the store, were proving inadequate for the real challenges of mountain tracking. Her feet were developing blisters, and her legs ached from the unaccustomed exertion. But she pushed forward, driven by guilt and determination. "There!" Tom pointed ahead to where the blood trail led around a large boulder. "But be careful. If he's cornered, He might charge. The warning proved prophetic. As they rounded the boulder, they found themselves face to face with the wounded buck. He stood on a narrow ledge about 20 feet above them, his eyes wild with pain and fear. Blood nattered his fur, and his breathing was labored. "He can't go any further," Tom observed. "The ledge ends in a sheer drop." Sarah stared up at the magnificent animal, overwhelmed by emotion. "What do we do now?" "I need a clear shot," Tom said, raising his rifle. "From this angle, I can end his suffering quickly." But as Tom aimed, the buck suddenly reared up on his hind legs, bellowing a sound of pain and defiance that echoed off the ravine walls. The sound was haunting, almost human in its expression of anguish. The cry seemed to wake something in the forest around them. Birds erupted from the trees, and somewhere in the distance Sarah heard what sounded like an answering call, though whether from another deer or something else she couldn't tell. Tom hesitated, his rifle still raised. "Something's not right," he murmured. That's when they heard it, the sound of approaching footsteps, moving fast through the forest above them. Sarah's heart began to race. They were miles from civilization, and she hadn't told anyone exactly where they would be hunting. "Tom," Marcus whispered urgently, his camera still recording but his face pale with concern. "Is someone else out here?" Before Tom could answer, a figure appeared at the top of the ravine. It was another hunter, but not like any Sarah had ever seen. He was dressed in traditional Cahto clothing, with leather and beads, his face painted with symbols she didn't recognize. Most unsettling of all, he moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. "Joseph!" Tom breathed, and Sarah detected both surprise and something like fear in his voice. The traditional hunter, Joseph, looked down at them with dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom and judgment. When he spoke, his voice carried easily down to them despite the distance. "You have disturbed the balance," Joseph said, his words heavily accented but clear. "The old ways demand completion." "We're trying to track the wounded animal," Tom called up. "The shot went wrong." Joseph's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt as if he was looking straight into her soul. The one who interfered must learn the true cost of her actions. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I'm sorry. I was trying to help." "Help?" Joseph's laugh was bitter. "You think the deer needs your help? You think our people, who have hunted these mountains for 1,000 years, need your guidance?" The wounded buck on the ledge had gone quiet, as if listening to the conversation. Sarah noticed that despite his injuries, the animal seemed less agitated in Joseph's presence. "Who is he?" Sarah whispered to Tom. "Joseph Blackwater," Tom replied quietly. "Some say he's the last true traditional hunter. Others say he's something more than that. He disappeared into these mountains years ago, after his family was killed in a car accident." Joseph began making his way down the steep ravine with impossible sure-footedness. Sarah watched in amazement as he seemed to flow down the rocky slope, never losing his balance or dislodging a single stone. "You came here to make a movie about our ways," Joseph said as he approached them, "but you understand nothing of what those ways truly mean." "Then teach me," Sarah said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I want to learn." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "Learning requires sacrifice. Are you prepared for that?" Before Sarah could answer, the wounded buck above them made a decision. With a final, desperate effort, he leaped from the ledge, not toward them but across the ravine to another outcropping. For a moment, it seemed he might make it, but his wounded body betrayed him. He fell short, crashing into the rocky slope and tumbling down toward them. Sarah screamed and threw herself backward as hundreds of pounds of panicked animal rolled past her. The buck came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, his breathing shallow and rapid. The fall had worsened his injuries, but he was still alive, still suffering. Joseph moved to the animal's side with gentle confidence. The buck, which had been wild with fear moments before, seemed to calm at his approach. Joseph placed one hand on the deer's head and began to speak in the Cahto language. Words Sarah couldn't understand, but that seemed to carry deep meaning. "What is he doing?" Marcus whispered, still filming despite the surreal nature of the situation. "He's asking the deer's permission," Tom explained, his voice full of respect, "and offering thanks for the gift of its life." Sarah watched in fascination as Joseph continued his quiet ritual. The buck's breathing became more regular, and the wild fear in its eyes seemed to fade. When Joseph finally drew his knife, the movement was swift and merciful. The suffering ended instantly. "It is finished," Joseph said, cleaning his blade on a handful of leaves. "But your education has only begun." He turned to face Sarah directly. "You wanted to document our ways, but you approached them as an outsider, trying to capture something you could never truly possess. Our traditions aren't performances for your camera." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. "I just wanted to understand my heritage. My grandmother never taught me before she died." "Your grandmother had her reasons," Joseph said, his tone softening slightly. "Sometimes knowledge must be earned through experience, not given freely." Tom stepped forward. "Joseph, she's trying to preserve our culture. The young people are forgetting the old ways. The young people are forgetting because they're being taught by people who have forgotten themselves." Joseph replied, "This woman comes with cameras and questions, but no understanding of the responsibility that comes with our knowledge." Marcus lowered his camera. "Should I stop recording?" "No," Joseph said unexpectedly. "Let her film. But let her film the truth, not the performance she came expecting." Joseph began the process of properly preparing the deer according to traditional practices. Every cut was deliberate, every action accompanied by quiet words of gratitude. Sarah watched, learning more about her heritage in these few minutes than she had in months of research. "The deer gave its life to teach you something," Joseph explained as he worked. "But the lesson isn't what you thought it would be." "What is the lesson?" Sarah asked. Joseph paused in his work and looked at her directly. "That some things cannot be captured by cameras or preserved in documentaries. They must be lived, experienced, earned through dedication and sacrifice." As the sun began to set, painting the ravine in shades of gold and red, Sarah realized her documentary had become something entirely different from what she had planned. The story she was now telling was not about preserving traditional hunting practices, but about the cost of trying to reclaim a heritage she had never truly understood. The real hunt she was beginning to understand was not for the deer. It was for her own identity, and it would require far more courage than she had imagined. The evening air grew cold as Joseph completed the traditional preparation of the deer. Sarah watched every movement, no longer filming for her documentary but trying to absorb knowledge that felt sacred. The ritual was nothing like the clinical process she had expected. It was reverent, almost ceremonial. "Every part has purpose," Joseph explained, his hands working with practiced skill. "Nothing is wasted, nothing is taken for granted. This deer will feed families, its hide will provide warmth, its bones will become tools." Marcus had stopped filming entirely, sitting quietly on a boulder as the reality of their situation sank in. They were miles from their vehicle. Darkness was approaching, and they were following a man who seemed to exist outside the normal world. "How do we get back?" Marcus asked nervously. "I can barely see the trail we took to get down here." Joseph looked up from his work, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "You don't go back. Not the same way you came. The person who descended into this ravine is not the same one who will climb out." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What do you mean? You came here seeking your heritage like it was something you could purchase or collect," Joseph said, wrapping portions of meat in large leaves. "But heritage isn't something you have. It's something you become." Tom, who had been unusually quiet since Joseph's arrival, finally spoke. "The old stories talk about tests like this, times when the mountains would challenge someone to discover their true nature." "Stories," Marcus muttered. "We need practical solutions. We need to get back to civilization." Joseph smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Civilization? You mean the place where people live disconnected from the earth that feeds them? Where they buy meat wrapped in plastic and never think about the life that was sacrificed for their comfort?" Sarah found herself defending her world, even though she was beginning to question it herself. "Not everyone can live in the mountains like you do. Society needs teachers, doctors, engineers. Society needs people who remember what it means to be human," Joseph countered. "People who understand their place in the natural order instead of trying to conquer it." As full darkness settled over the ravine, Joseph built a small fire using techniques that seemed effortless. The flames danced against the rocky walls, creating shifting shadows that made the place feel even more otherworldly. "We'll spend the night here," Joseph announced. "In the morning, you'll begin to understand what you really came to learn." Sarah wanted to protest. She had a flight back to Los Angeles in 2 days, meetings scheduled, a life waiting for her. But something in Joseph's manner made arguments seem pointless. They shared a simple meal of prepared venison, cooked over the open fire. The meat was unlike anything Sarah had ever tasted, rich and flavorful in a way that connected her directly to the forest around them. As they ate, Joseph told stories of his ancestors, of hunts that were spiritual journeys, and of hunters who learned to speak the language of the animals. Your grandmother knew these stories, Joseph said, looking directly at Sarah. But she also knew you weren't ready to hear them. Not until you had learned to listen properly. How could you know about my grandmother? Sarah asked. She died 2 years ago. Joseph poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. Elena Martinez, born Elena Crowfeather. She was my cousin. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. You knew her? I knew her before she chose to leave the reservation, before she decided that the old ways were too difficult for the modern world. Joseph's voice carried old sadness. She was a gifted healer, but she wanted her children and grandchildren to have easier lives. Sarah stared into the fire, processing this information. She never told me she had family on the reservation. She had her reasons, Tom interjected gently. The early 20th century was hard on our people. Many families were broken up, children taken to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking our language or practicing our customs. Joseph nodded grimly. Elena saw what that system did to her brothers and sisters. She thought distance and assimilation would protect her descendants from that pain. But it didn't protect us from a different kind of pain, Sarah realized. The pain of not knowing who we are. That's why you're here, Joseph said. Elena may have thought she was saving you from struggle, but some struggles are necessary for growth. Marcus, who had been listening to this family revelation in stunned silence, finally found his voice. This is incredible. Sarah, you realize what this means? Your documentary just became a personal journey of discovery. But Sarah was no longer thinking about the documentary. The camera and equipment suddenly seemed like barriers between her and the truth she was seeking. I want to learn, she said to Joseph. Really learn, not just film. Joseph studied her face in the firelight. Learning the old ways requires commitment. It means accepting that some knowledge comes with responsibility. Are you prepared to change your entire life? Before Sarah could answer, they heard a sound that made everyone freeze. From somewhere in the darkness above them came a long, haunting howl. It was answered by another, then another, until the night air filled with the voices of wolves. They smell the blood, Tom whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. But Joseph showed no fear. Instead, he stood and walked to the edge of their firelight, tilting his head back and releasing his own howl into the night. The sound was so perfectly pitched, so authentically wild, that Sarah felt her hair stand on end. The wolves went quiet, as if listening. Then, one by one, they began to howl again. But this time the sound was different, less threatening, more conversational. What just happened? Marcus breathed. He told them we're not a threat, Tom explained, awe in his voice, that we've taken only what we need and treated the deer with proper respect. Joseph returned to the fire, settling back down as if nothing unusual had occurred. The wolves understand the old agreements. They know the difference between hunting for need and killing for sport. Sarah felt something fundamental shifting inside her. The logical, urban part of her mind wanted to dismiss what she was witnessing as coincidence or exaggeration. But another part, a deeper part she was just beginning to recognize, accepted it completely. Teach me, she said quietly. Forget the documentary. Forget everything I thought I wanted. Just teach me. Joseph smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. The teaching has already begun. Every moment since you interfered with Tom's shot has been a lesson. Over the next several hours, as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Joseph shared knowledge that Sarah's grandmother had never spoken of. He taught her to read the subtle signs that animals left behind, to understand the language of wind and weather, to feel her connection to the living world around her. Your people in the city think they're separate from nature, Joseph explained. They live in boxes, eat food grown by strangers, and wonder why they feel empty inside. But we are nature. Every cell in our bodies was borrowed from the earth, and will return to it. Marcus had fallen asleep against his camera bag, exhausted by the day's events and overwhelmed by experiences his urban mind couldn't process. But Sarah remained wide awake, absorbing every word. What about my life in Los Angeles? She asked as dawn began to lighten the sky. My career, my apartment, my friends? Joseph shrugged. What about them? Will they matter when you're dying? Will they give your life meaning, or will you wish you had spent your time learning to be truly alive? As the sun rose over the ravine, Sarah realized she was facing a choice she had never imagined. She could return to Los Angeles, edit her documentary, and continue her comfortable but ultimately unsatisfying life. Or she could stay, learning the ways her grandmother had abandoned, becoming part of something larger than herself. Tom stirred the coals of their fire back to life. Whatever you decide, he said to Sarah, you can't go back to being the person who entered these mountains yesterday. Sarah looked around the ravine that had become a classroom, at the place where the deer had given its life to teach her about sacrifice and responsibility. She thought about her grandmother, Elena, who had made her own difficult choice decades earlier. But Sarah was not her grandmother. She had different challenges, different opportunities, and perhaps different courage. I need time to think, she said finally. Joseph nodded approvingly. Good. Hasty decisions rarely lead to wisdom. But remember, the mountains will always be here when you're ready to come home. As they prepared to climb out of the ravine, Sarah realized that regardless of what choice she made about her future, she would never again be the naive documentarian who had entered the forest. The blood that had fallen, the bullet that had wounded, and the Cahto hunter who had moved fast to complete what was begun, all of it had changed her forever. The real hunt had indeed ended, but Sarah's true journey was just beginning.